It was just another ordinary Tuesday morning, or so it seemed. The sun was shining, the streets were bustling, and the city was alive with its usual rhythm. But for one woman, this day would be anything but ordinary. Dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail, she walked into the branch of her own bank. To anyone watching, she was just another customer, but the truth was far more intriguing. She wasn't there to deposit a check or ask about interest rates. She was there to see her empire from the ground up, to hear firsthand what her employees and customers really thought. She was the CEO of one of the largest banks in the country, and today she was undercover. The idea had come to her during a late-night board meeting. Reports were glowing, profits were up, and everything on paper looked perfect. But something nagged at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something real, something human. So, she made a decision. No entourage, no announcements, no special treatment. Just her walking into one of her branches, ready to see the truth for herself. What she didn't expect was what she would hear the moment she stepped through those glass doors. The branch was busy, the hum of conversation filling the air. Customers lined up at the counters, tapping their feet impatiently, while tellers worked quickly, their smiles polite but strained. She stood in line, observing everything, the way the employees interacted, the way the customers reacted, and then she heard it. A sound that stopped her cold. It was soft at first, almost drowned out by the noise of the branch, but unmistakable. Someone was crying. Her eyes darted to the source of the sound. Behind the counter, a young teller, no older than 25, was struggling to keep her composure. Her hands trembled as she counted cash, her voice shaky as she tried to assist the customer in front of her. But the tears were winning. They streamed down her face, and she kept wiping them away, trying to hide them, trying to keep going. The customer, an older man, looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure of what to do. The CEO felt her chest tighten. What was happening here? Why was this young woman crying in the middle of her shift? And why had no one stepped in to help her? She wanted to rush over, to demand answers, to fix whatever was wrong, but she couldn't. Not yet. She was undercover, and revealing herself now would ruin everything. So she stayed in line, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She watched as the teller finished the transaction, her hands still shaking, her face still wet with tears. The customer left without a word, and the teller quickly excused herself, disappearing into a back room. The CEO's eyes followed her, her mind spinning, with questions. What had caused this? Was it a personal issue? Or was it something deeper, something tied to the bank itself? As she moved closer to the front of the line, she couldn't shake the image of the crying teller from her mind. She thought about the reports on her desk, the numbers that looked so good on paper, but numbers didn't tell the whole story. They didn't show the human side of things, the stress, the struggles, the tears. She had built this bank from the ground up, pouring her heart and soul into it. But now, standing here, she couldn't help but wonder, had she lost sight of the people who made it all possible? When it was finally her turn, she stepped up to the counter, her mind still reeling. The teller in front of her, a different one this time, smiled politely and asked how she could help, but the CEO barely heard her. Her eyes kept drifting to the door where the crying teller had disappeared. She needed to know what was going on. She needed to understand. But how could she get the answers she was looking for without blowing her cover? And what would she do if the truth was more than she could handle? The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Something was wrong here. Something big, and she was determined to find out what it was. But as she stood there, frozen in place, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever was happening in this branch, it was bigger than one crying teller. It was a story that went deeper, a story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her bank and about herself. And then, just as she was about to make her move, the door to the back room opened. The crying teller stepped out, her face now composed, her eyes red but dry. She walked back to her station, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone carrying a heavy burden. The CEO watched her closely, her heart racing. What had happened? In that back room? What had been said or done to make this young woman pull herself together so quickly? And what would happen next? The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And as the CEO stood there, her mind racing with possibilities, she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The CEO stood frozen at the counter, her mind racing as she watched the young teller return to her station. The woman's face was calm now, but her eyes told a different story. They were hollow, almost lifeless, as if she'd shut down a part of herself just to get through the day. The CEO felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had seen that look before years ago when she was just starting out in the banking world. It was the look of someone who had been pushed too far, someone who was drowning but didn't know how to ask for help. The teller assisting her, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, cleared her throat gently, pulling her back to the present. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of dealing with impatient customers. The CEO hesitated, her eyes flicking back to the young teller. She needed to buy herself some time to figure out how to get closer to the truth without raising suspicion. I'd like to open a new account," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The teller nodded and began typing on her computer, asking the usual questions. Name, address, identification. The CEO provided the information she'd prepared in advance, her mind only half on the task at hand. The rest of her attention was focused on the young teller, who was now helping another customer, her hands still trembling slightly as she counted out cash. As the teller processed her request, the CEO glanced around the branch, taking in the details she might have missed. Before, the walls were lined with posters advertising low-interest loans and high-yield savings accounts, the kind of promises that drew customers in, but often left them feeling disillusioned. The employees moved with a kind of robotic efficiency, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. It was a far cry from the vibrant, customer-focused environment she had envisioned when she first started the bank. What had happened here? When had her vision of empowering people through financial services turned into this? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices near the entrance. A man in a suit, clearly a manager, was speaking sharply to one of the security guards. "I don't care what the policy is, we can't have this kind of disruption in the branch," he hissed, his voice low but laced with anger. The guard nodded, looking uncomfortable, and hurried off to deal with whatever issue had arisen. The CEO's eyes narrowed. Disruption? What kind of disruption? And why was the manager so on edge? She turned back to the teller, who was now handing her a stack of forms to sign. "Is everything okay here?" she asked casually, nodding toward the manager. The teller followed her gaze and sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Oh, that's just Mr. Grayson. Well, let's just say he's very focused on keeping things running smoothly." There was something in her tone, a hint of bitterness maybe, or resignation, that made the CEO's stomach churn. She wanted to press further, to ask what exactly that meant, but she knew she had to be careful. One wrong move and her cover would be blown. As she signed the forms, her mind raced. Mr. Grayson. She didn't recognize the name, which meant he was likely a mid-level manager, someone who had been hired long after she'd stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the bank. But his demeanor, the way he spoke to the guard, it didn't sit right with her. She made a mental note to look into his file as soon as she got back to her office. For now, though, she needed to focus on the young teller. There was something about her, something that tugged at the CEO's conscience. She couldn't just walk away, not without knowing what was going on. When the teller handed her the final paperwork, the CEO forced a smile and thanked her, then stepped aside to let the next customer approach the counter. She lingered near the edge of the lobby, pretending to review the documents she'd just been given. Out of the corner of her eye, she watched the young teller, The woman was helping, an elderly couple now, her voice soft and patient as she explained the details of a savings account. But her hands were still shaking, and every so often she would glance toward the back room, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. The CEO's curiosity was burning now. She needed to know what was in that back room, what or who was causing this young woman so much distress. But how could she get back there without drawing attention to herself? She glanced around the branch, her eyes landing on a small sign near the restrooms that read, "Employees Only." That was her way in, but she couldn't just walk through that door. She needed a plan. As she stood there trying to figure out her next move, the young teller finished with the elderly couple and excused herself again, this time heading toward the restrooms. The CEO's heart skipped a beat. This was her chance. She waited a few seconds, then followed, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. When she reached the hallway, she paused, listening. The sound of running water came from the women's restroom, followed by the faint sound of sobbing. Her chest tightened. The young teller was in there, crying again. The CEO hesitated, torn between her desire to comfort the woman and the need to maintain her cover. Before she could decide what to do, the door to the restroom opened and the young teller stepped out, her face pale and her eyes red. She froze when she saw the CEO standing there, her expression a mix of surprise and fear. I'm sorry," she stammered, quickly wiping her eyes. "I didn't realize anyone was here." The CEO's heart ached for her. "It's okay," she said gently, her voice soft but firm. "Are you all right?" The young woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the lobby as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice trembled. "Just a long day." The CEO wanted to press further, to ask what was really going on, but she knew she couldn't. Not here, not now. Instead, she nodded and stepped aside, letting the young teller pass. As she watched the woman walk back to her station, her shoulders hunched and her head down, the CEO felt a surge of determination. She didn't know what was happening in this branch, but she was going to find out. And once she did, she would make sure it never happened again. But as she turned to leave, she heard a voice behind her, a deep, authoritative voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Can I help you?" She turned to see Mr. Grayson standing there, his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed. For a moment, she was at a loss for words. Then she forced a smile and held up the paperwork she'd been given. "Just looking for the exit," she said, her tone light but her heart pounding. Mr. Grayson studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded toward the lobby. "It's right through there." She thanked him and walked away, her mind racing. She could feel his eyes on her as she left, and she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the CEO took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had come here to see the truth, and now she had. But the truth was far more complicated and far more troubling than she had ever imagined. Something was very wrong in this branch, and it went deeper than one crying teller. She didn't know what she was going to do next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let this go. Not now. Not ever. The story was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. But as she walked away from the branch, her resolve hardened. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. And when she did, she would make sure that no one in her bank ever had to cry alone again. The CEO walked briskly down the street, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The image of the young teller's tear-streaked face haunted her, and the cold, calculating demeanor of Mr. Grayson only added to her unease. She needed answers, but she couldn't risk revealing her identity. Not yet. Not until she knew exactly what she was dealing with. As she turned the corner, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Ellen? It's been a while. What's going on?" It was Marcus, her old friend and former colleague, who now worked as a private investigator. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but if anyone could help her uncover the truth, it was him. "I need your help," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Something's happening at one of my branches, and I need to know what it is. Can you meet me?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Marcus sighed. "You always did have a knack for getting into trouble. Where are you?" She gave him the address of a small cafe a few blocks away, then hung up and quickened her pace. By the time she arrived at the cafe, Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked older than she remembered, his hair streaked with gray, but his sharp eyes still held the same intensity. He stood as she approached, giving her a quick hug before gesturing for her to sit. "So," he said, leaning forward, "what's this about?" She took a deep breath, then began to explain everything. The undercover visit, the crying teller, the tense atmosphere in the branch, and the unsettling presence of Mr. Grayson. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table. "Sounds like you've got a mess on your hands," he said finally. "But if you want my help, you're going to have to let me do this my way. No interference, no sudden appearances. Understood?" She nodded, though the thought of stepping back made her uneasy. But she trusted Marcus, and she knew he was right. If she wanted to get to the bottom of this, she couldn't risk blowing her cover. "What's the plan?" she asked. Marcus smiled, but there was no humor in it. "First, I need to get inside that branch. I'll pose as a customer, see what I can find out. Then we'll go from there." As they talked, the CEO couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface. There was something bigger going on here, something darker than she had initially realized. But what? And how far did it go? She thought about the young teller, about the way she had looked at the back room, as if it held some terrible secret. What was in there? And why was Mr. Grayson so determined to keep things under control? Meanwhile, back at the branch, the young teller, her name was Sarah, was struggling to keep it together. She had managed to pull herself together after her encounter with the CEO, but the weight of everything she was dealing with was crushing her. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Mr. Grayson earlier that morning, his cold, dismissive tone as he'd told her to get it together, or face the consequences. She thought about the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table, the mounting pressure of her student loans, and the constant fear that she was one mistake away from losing her job. But it wasn't just the financial stress that was eating away at her. It was the way Mr. Grayson treated the employees, the way he micromanaged every aspect of their work, the way he seemed to take pleasure in their struggles. She had tried to talk to him about it once to explain how the constant pressure was affecting her and her co-workers, but he had brushed her off, telling her that if she couldn't handle the job, she was free to leave. As she stood at her station, helping yet another customer, Sarah's mind wandered to the back room, the place where Mr. Grayson spent most of his time. She had only been in there a few times, but each visit had left her feeling uneasy. There was something off about that room, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She thought about the files she had seen on his desk, the strange conversations she had overheard, and the way he always seemed to be watching, waiting, as if he knew something the rest of them didn't. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices near the entrance. She turned to see Mr. Grayson arguing with a customer, a man in his late 30s dressed in a worn jacket and jeans. The man was clearly upset, his voice rising as he demanded to speak to someone in charge. "I've been trying to get this resolved for weeks," he shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. "Every time I call, I get the runaround. What kind of bank treats its customers like this?" Mr. Grayson's face was a mask of calm, but Sarah could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Sir, if you'll just calm down, I'm sure we can resolve this," he said, his tone clipped. But the man wasn't having it. "Calm down? Do you have any idea what I've been through? I've lost everything because of your bank's mistakes, and you're telling me to calm down?" Sarah's heart ached for the man. She had seen this before. Customers who had been pushed to their limits by the bank's policies, by the endless bureaucracy, by the lack of empathy from people like Mr. Grayson. She wanted to help him, to do something, anything, to make things right. But she knew better. If she stepped in, if she said the wrong thing, she would only make things worse for herself and for the customer. As the argument escalated, Sarah felt a familiar sense of helplessness wash over her. She thought about the CEO, about the way she had looked at her earlier with something that might have been concern. But what could one person do against a system that seemed designed to crush them? She didn't know. All she knew was that she couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. But as she stood there, watching Mr. Grayson dismiss the customer with a cold, calculated efficiency, she couldn't help but wonder, was change even possible? Or was this just the way things were, the way they would always be? The tension in the branch was palpable, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press down on everyone. And as the day wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. She didn't know what it was, or when it would happen, but she knew one thing for sure. When it did, nothing would ever be the same. Meanwhile, Marcus was making his way to the branch, his mind already working through the details of his plan. He didn't know what he would find there, but he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. As he approached the building, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The story was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. But one thing was certain, the truth was out there, waiting to be discovered, and he was going to find it. The branch was quieter now, the lunchtime rush having subsided, but the tension in the air was thicker than ever. Sarah stood at her station, her hands trembling as she counted out cash for a customer. She could feel Mr. Grayson's eyes on her from across the room, his gaze like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to the argument she had witnessed earlier, to the man who had stormed out in frustration, his voice still echoing in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something big. Across the lobby, Marcus sat at one of the small tables near the window, pretending to review a stack of papers he had brought with him. He had been there for nearly an hour, observing the employees, the customers, and most importantly, Mr. Grayson. The man was a puzzle, calm and collected on the surface, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. Marcus had seen his type before, the kind of person who thrived on control, who enjoyed wielding power over others. But there was more to it than that. There was something hidden, something dark, and Marcus was determined to find out what it was. As he watched, Mr. Grayson disappeared into the back room, the door closing firmly behind him. Marcus glanced at his watch. It was now or never. He stood gathering his papers and made his way toward the restrooms. When he reached the hallway, he paused, listening. The sound of voices came from the back room, low and urgent. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, frustration, fear. He took a deep breath, then stepped closer, his heart pounding. Inside the back room, Mr. Grayson was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what it takes," he hissed, his voice low but sharp. "You need to make this go away. If anyone finds out—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the door creak open slightly. "I'll call you back," he said quickly, then hung up and strode toward the door. Marcus barely had time to react. He ducked into the restroom, his heart racing, and waited. A moment later, he heard the sound of footsteps passing by, then fading away. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and stepped back into the hallway. The back room door was slightly ajar now, and he could see a sliver of light spilling out. He hesitated, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, with files stacked haphazardly on every surface. A desk sat in the corner, its surface covered in papers, a laptop, and a half-empty coffee cup. Marcus moved quickly, scanning the documents for anything that might give him a clue as to what was going on. His eyes landed on a file labeled Confidential, Customer, Complaints. He opened it, his heart sinking as he read through the pages. The complaints were numerous and varied. Unauthorized charges, frozen accounts, missing funds. But they all had one thing in common. They had been ignored, dismissed, or buried. As he flipped through the file, a name caught his eye. Sarah Miller. He frowned, trying to place it, then remembered the young teller he had seen earlier. the one who had been crying. He scanned the document, his stomach churning as he read the details. Sarah had filed a complaint months ago, alleging that Mr. Grayson had been harassing her, pressuring her to meet unrealistic quotas and threatening her job if she didn't comply. The complaint had been marked resolved, but from what Marcus had seen, it was anything but. He closed the file, his mind racing. This was worse than he had thought, much worse. He needed to get this information to the CEO, but he couldn't risk being caught. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few quick photos of the documents, then slipped the file back into place and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, he froze. The sound of footsteps was coming down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus's heart pounded as he glanced around the room, looking for a way out. There was no other exit, no place to hide. He was trapped. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open, and Mr. Grayson stepped inside. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other, the tension in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. Then Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed, and a cold smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "What do we have here?" Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, a way out. But before he could think of anything, Mr. Grayson stepped closer, his eyes locked on Marcus's. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly, his tone almost conversational. "But since you have, I suppose we'll have to make the best of it." Marcus's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. He was in over his head, and there was no easy way out. But he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The stakes were higher than ever, and the tension was reaching its breaking point. But one thing was certain. This was far from over. Meanwhile, Sarah was still at her station, her hands trembling as she helped another customer. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, the fear, the frustration, the helplessness. She thought about the CEO, about the way she had looked at her earlier, with something that might have been concern. She thought about the man who had stormed out in anger, about the countless other customers who had been treated unfairly, and about the files she had seen in Mr. Grayson's office. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change, and as she stood there watching Mr. Grayson return to the lobby, a cold, calculating look in his eyes, she realized that she might be the only one who could make that change happen. The tension in the branch was palpable, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press down on everyone. And as the day wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. She didn't know what it was, or when it would happen. But she knew one thing for sure. When it did, nothing would ever be the same. The story was building to its climax, the stakes higher than ever, and the tension reaching its peak. But the resolution was still out of reach, the outcome uncertain. And as the characters stood on the brink of the unknown, one thing was clear. The truth was coming, and it would change everything.